Daniel sat in the living room, the gentle hum of the dishwasher filling the space with a soft white noise. He stared at his phone, scrolling through emails, but his mind wasn't on work. His attention kept drifting upstairs where Julia was, like always, absorbed in her phone. It had become a familiar scene in their household, each in their own corner of the house, silent, distant, as if the air between them was heavy with things unsaid. 12 years. That's how long they had been married. And for most of those years, Daniel had been happy. Sure, there were the usual ups and downs, arguments about small things, moments of irritation, but nothing serious. They had always been close. At least, he thought so. But recently, something had shifted. He couldn't pinpoint when exactly, but he felt the space growing between them like a slow, creeping fog. Julia had become distant, distracted, her once warm laugh replaced by quiet nods and vague smiles. She had always been a little introverted, but this was different. There were more late nights out with friends, more evenings spent in silence. And then there were the long glances at her phone, the quick swipes across the screen when he walked into the room. It gnawed at him, but Daniel tried to push it aside. Maybe it was work stress, he told himself. Julia had been promoted recently, and with that came new pressures. But that explanation didn't sit right with him. She wasn't just stressed, she was pulling away. And Daniel didn't know why. A few days ago, they had gone out for dinner. It was meant to be a chance to reconnect, to talk, to remind themselves why they enjoyed each other's company. But the evening had been hollow. They sat across from each other at the restaurant, sharing polite conversation, but the intimacy was gone. Daniel had spent most of the meal watching her fidget with her phone, her eyes darting to it every few minutes, waiting for something. Someone. "What's going on, Julia?" he had asked, trying to keep his voice calm. She had looked up, startled, as though she hadn't realized he'd been speaking. "Nothing. Just checking on some emails. Work's been intense lately." But Daniel wasn't sure he believed her. He had tried to let it go, to brush off the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut, but it lingered, gnawing at him every time her phone buzzed, every time she turned away when he tried to talk to her. The next morning, Daniel stood at the kitchen counter, stirring sugar into his coffee. He glanced at Julia, who was sitting across from him at the table, her phone in hand. The tension in the room was palpable, though neither of them acknowledged it. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Julia looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected him to speak. "Yeah, just tired," she said, flashing him a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Tough week?" he pressed. "Something like that." She looked back at her phone, and Daniel's heart sank. He knew he should say more, ask her what was really going on, but he didn't. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee and let the silence stretch between them. That evening, Daniel found himself alone again. Julia had texted to say she was going out for dinner with friends. Tara and the others from work, she said, and she probably wouldn't be home until late. Daniel tried not to let it bother him, but the distance between them was becoming impossible to ignore. He had never doubted Julia's loyalty before. They had been through so much together. She wasn't the type to stray. But then again, had he ever really thought she'd grow so distant? That she'd start leaving him out of her life? It wasn't just the late nights, it was everything. The way she no longer touched him, the way she barely looked at him when they were together. And then there was the phone, always in her hand, always taking her attention. Daniel told himself he was being paranoid, that he was imagining things, but deep down he knew that something had changed. He just didn't know what. The tipping point came the following weekend. They had been invited to a friend's birthday party, and Daniel had been looking forward to it. A chance to get out of the house, to be around other people, to maybe see a glimpse of the old Julia. But that evening, as they were getting ready to leave, Julia suddenly announced that she didn't feel well. "I think I'll stay home," she said, rubbing her temples as if she had a headache. Daniel had stared at her, trying to gauge whether she was being honest or if this was another excuse to avoid spending time together. "You seemed fine earlier." "I just don't feel up to it," she insisted. "You should still go. It's your friend's party, after all." The idea of going alone didn't sit well with him, but he didn't want to force her. "Okay," he said finally. though something about the situation didn't feel right. Later that night, after returning home from the party, Daniel found Julia asleep on the couch, her phone resting on the coffee table beside her. He stood there for a moment, staring at her peaceful face, trying to make sense of the tension that had been building between them. She looked so calm, so unaffected, as if nothing was wrong. His eyes drifted to the phone, the source of so much of his recent unease. Without thinking, he picked it up. It was locked, of course, but after a brief hesitation, he entered the passcode. They had shared the same one for years, a small sign of trust in a marriage that no longer felt secure. Daniel wasn't sure what he was looking for. He didn't think Julia was hiding anything serious, at least he hoped she wasn't. But his gut told him there was something he wasn't seeing. He scrolled through her messages, feeling a growing sense of guilt. He knew he shouldn't be doing this, but he couldn't stop. Most of the conversations were innocent. Work chats, messages from her friends, nothing unusual. But then one name stood out. Mark. He hadn't heard her mention a Mark before. Maybe a work colleague? He clicked on the conversation, and as the messages loaded, his heart sank. Mark, I miss talking to you. When can we meet again? Julia. I miss you too. Maybe next week? I'll find a way. Daniel's mind raced as he read the words. His stomach twisted into a knot. This wasn't just a friendly conversation. This was something else. Something deeper. His hand shook as he scrolled further, reading more messages. Small, seemingly insignificant phrases that painted a picture of something he wasn't prepared for. Mark, last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Julia. Me too. I'll make sure Daniel doesn't suspect anything. The phone slipped from Daniel's hand, landing softly on the couch. He stood there, frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just read. His legs felt weak, and he sank into the armchair across from Julia, staring at her as she slept. His wife, his partner for 12 years, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone. And yet, here she was, exchanging intimate messages with another man. How long had this been going on? How had he missed the signs? Or had he been ignoring them all along, convincing himself that their marriage was still solid, still untouchable? The clock ticked in the background, but time felt like it had stopped. Daniel didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to think. All he knew was that everything had just changed. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. After reading the messages, every part of him ached with betrayal, disbelief, and confusion. He lay on his side of the bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to Julia's soft breathing beside him. The woman lying next to him was a stranger. How could she have done this? How could she lie to his face, go through their daily routines, kiss him goodnight, and then send messages like, "I'll make sure Daniel doesn't suspect anything"? He kept replaying the messages in his head, each word twisting deeper into his heart like a knife. But what hurt the most was how normal she seemed, as if nothing were wrong. For the next few days, Daniel tried to keep up the illusion that everything was normal. He wanted to believe that this was just a misunderstanding, that maybe the messages weren't what they seemed. But the more he thought about it, the harder it became to lie to himself. Julia was having an affair, maybe not a physical one, but emotional, intimate, and secret. The kind that could tear apart the trust they had built. It was Saturday morning when Daniel's obsession truly took hold. Julia had left early to meet a friend for breakfast, and he knew immediately who that friend was. He could no longer pretend otherwise. The Mark he had never heard of was more than just a name in her phone. He was a real person who had infiltrated their marriage. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his phone clutched in his hand. He had never felt the urge to track Julia before, but now the temptation was overwhelming. They had the location-sharing app on their phones, originally intended for convenience, so they could see each other's locations during busy workdays or while traveling. Julia had forgotten to turn it off. That was all the opening Daniel needed. He opened the app and saw the familiar icon marking her location. His stomach churned. She wasn't at a breakfast place. She wasn't anywhere near where she'd said she would be. Instead, she was in a quiet neighborhood, nowhere near downtown. He knew that neighborhood. He'd driven through it 100 times before, Mark lived there. Daniel's hands shook as he set the phone down on the table, staring at the map, watching her dot stay stationary. Julia returned in the early afternoon, a lightness in her step that only fueled Daniel's growing resentment. She walked through the door and greeted him with the same disarming smile he had fallen in love with years ago, as if nothing were wrong, as if her morning had been perfectly ordinary. "Breakfast turned into lunch," she said, hanging her jacket on the hook by the door. "Tara and I just lost track of time." Daniel studied her carefully, forcing a smile. "Sounds nice. Did you have fun?" "Yeah, it was good to catch up," Julia replied, turning away quickly, heading to the kitchen as if eager to change the subject. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he watched her. Her lie was so smooth, so effortless. She didn't flinch, didn't stutter. He wanted to call her out right then, but something held him back. He wasn't ready. Not yet. That night, Julia went to bed early, claiming she was exhausted. Daniel stayed downstairs, sipping a glass of whiskey in the dim light of the living room. His mind raced with questions, doubts, and flashes of anger. Was this his fault? Had he driven her into someone else's arms? He replayed the past few years of their marriage in his head, trying to pinpoint the moment things had gone wrong. He thought back to all the nights he had worked late, the times he had come home tired and distant, too preoccupied with his own life to notice that Julia was slipping away. But it wasn't his fault. No matter how hard things had gotten, no matter how busy or distracted he'd been, he had never crossed that line. He had always been faithful. The sound of Julia's phone vibrating on the coffee table broke through his thoughts. She had forgotten it downstairs. Daniel stared at it, the glow from the screen illuminating the room. He knew he shouldn't, but he couldn't resist. He unlocked the phone, and there it was. Another message from Mark. "Mark, this morning was perfect. I miss you already." Daniel's chest tightened. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something that could be explained away. She was with him that morning, not Tara. His hands trembled as he scrolled further back through the messages. There were dozens of them, intimate, flirtatious, full of affection. Julia had never spoken to him like this in years. The way she wrote to Mark was like she was a different person, someone who was alive and vibrant, full of passion. The realization hit him like a freight train. She had emotionally left their marriage long ago, and he had been too blind to see it. The next morning, Daniel was a man unmoored. Julia was in the shower, and he sat on the edge of their bed, her phone in his hands, reading message after message. Every sentence, every stolen word between them felt like a slap to his face. He had never been the type to pry, never the kind to doubt her. But this wasn't something he could unsee. He glanced toward the bathroom, the sound of the running water providing a strange calmness in the midst of his chaos. He knew he had to confront her. But the question was when and how. Should he confront her with anger? Or would he crumble under the weight of his heartbreak? He found himself opening her photo gallery, hands moving on their own, looking for more proof, more betrayal. His breath caught in his throat when he found what he had been dreading. A selfie, taken just a few days ago. Julia was smiling, her hair falling over her shoulders in soft waves, her eyes bright with a happiness Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. But what hurt the most was that it wasn't just her. Mark was in the photo with her, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing as though they had nothing to hide. Daniel shut the phone, his heart racing. His pulse throbbed in his ears as he fought back the urge to storm into the bathroom and demand answers. His hands curled into fists, his knuckles white. How long had this been going on? How could she have done this to him? But instead of acting, he stood up slowly and walked downstairs. He wasn't ready to face it yet. He wasn't ready for the truth. He needed time to think, time to decide what he was going to do. Meanwhile, Julia stepped out of the shower, the steam filling the bathroom as she wrapped a towel around herself. She felt a strange sense of calm. The guilt that had been gnawing at her over the past few months had subsided, replaced by a quiet numbness. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She knew the affair with Mark had crossed a line, but it was hard to stop. He made her feel alive, seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. She didn't want to hurt Daniel. But she couldn't bring herself to end things with Mark either. Every time she tried, every time she promised herself that this would be the last message, the last coffee, the last kiss, she found herself drawn back to him. It was as if she were caught between two worlds: the life she had built with Daniel, stable and predictable, and the rush of excitement and affection that Mark offered. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror, wiping away the fog with her hand. Her face looked the same, but she felt like a different person. Who was she now? And how much longer could she keep pretending? That evening, they sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence heavy and oppressive. Daniel picked at his food, his mind racing with everything he had seen and read. He looked at Julia, wondering how she could sit there so calmly, how she could act as though nothing were wrong. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice light, as though this were just another ordinary night. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Fine," he lied. But inside, he was anything but fine. He was unraveling, piece by piece, trying to figure out when everything had gone wrong and how much longer he could keep pretending it hadn't. The days after Daniel found the selfie of Julia and Mark dragged on in agonizing silence. His thoughts swirled constantly, bouncing between betrayal, rage, and a strange sense of helplessness. He felt like a spectator in his own life, watching from a distance as Julia moved through their shared space, unaware of the storm brewing inside him. Every glance, every touch, every word from her felt like a lie. One evening, Julia was out late again. She hadn't given him a solid reason, just work stuff. That had been her excuse more and more lately. Daniel sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, but nothing on the screen registered. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the same scene over and over. Julia with Mark, her smiling face, her phone lighting up with messages she would never share with him. He had planned on confronting her earlier, but every time she walked through the door, the words would die on his lips. His mind kept telling him to wait, to gather more evidence. But what was he waiting for? What more did he need to know? The door creaked open, and Julia stepped inside, her hair tousled by the evening breeze. She wore the same coat she always did, but tonight Daniel noticed how she adjusted it as she walked through the hallway, hiding something maybe. She glanced at him and gave a soft smile. "Hey," she said, kicking off her shoes. "Sorry I'm late. The meeting ran longer than expected." Daniel clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the armrest of the couch. His heart was pounding in his chest, a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to shake him from the inside out. He couldn't let her brush past him tonight. Not again. "Julia," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. She paused in the middle of unbuttoning her coat, turning to face him. "What's up?" "I know." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and charged. Julia frowned, confused at first. "You know what?" "I know about Mark," Daniel said, his voice firmer this time. "I know about the messages. I've seen everything." For a moment, Julia didn't move. She stood frozen in the hallway, staring at him with wide eyes, her coat half open. The silence between them deepened, thickened, until it became unbearable. She started, but the words stuck in her throat. She swallowed hard, her face paling. "Daniel, it's not what you think." "Not what I think?" Daniel's voice cracked with disbelief. He stood up from the couch, his hands trembling with the weight of his rage. "I've seen the messages, Julia, the photos. I know you've been lying to me for months. Don't tell me it's not what I think." Julia took a step back, as if the force of his words had physically pushed her. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to go this far." "Go this far?" Daniel's anger surged. "You've been meeting him behind my back, sending messages, sneaking around. How long has this been going on?" She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if unsure of what to say. Daniel could see the guilt and fear in her eyes, but it didn't make him feel any better. If anything, it made him angrier. "Answer me," Daniel demanded, his voice rising. "How long, Julia?" Julia's lips trembled as she spoke, her voice so soft he could barely hear her. 6 months. Daniel staggered backward, the weight of her confession hitting him like a physical blow. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of pretending, of living in the same house with her while she carried on a secret life with another man. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you do it?" Julia shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know. I was lonely, Daniel. We've been so distant. I just—" "Lonely?" Daniel interrupted, his voice sharp and cutting. "We've been distant because you've been sneaking around behind my back. You've been pulling away for months, and I thought it was work or stress, but it was him, wasn't it?" Tears slipped down Julia's cheeks as she shook her head. "It wasn't just him. It was us, Daniel. We stopped talking. We stopped connecting. I needed someone to talk to, someone who understood me." Daniel laughed bitterly, his hands clenched into fists. "So, instead of talking to me, you found someone else? You decided that sneaking around, lying to my face every day, was the better option?" Julia wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't plan for this to happen. Mark and I, we started talking as friends, but it became something more. And I didn't know how to stop it." "Didn't know how to stop?" Daniel's voice was full of scorn. "You didn't want to stop. You kept going because it made you feel good. Because he made you feel special, right?" Julia sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Daniel stared at her, his chest tight with a mix of fury and heartbreak. He had imagined this moment for weeks, fantasizing about how he would finally confront her, how she would admit everything, and how he would feel victorious. But standing here now, all he felt was emptiness. "Why didn't you just leave?" he asked, his voice raw. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth and leave?" "I didn't want to leave," Julia whispered, her voice muffled by her hands. "I didn't want to lose you, Daniel. I love you." Daniel recoiled, disgusted by the words. "You love me? You love me, and you've been seeing someone else for 6 months?" "I never meant for it to get this far," Julia repeated, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," Daniel snapped. "You succeeded anyway." Julia looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her expression full of regret. "I don't know what to say. I can't undo what I've done. I know I've hurt you, and I don't deserve your forgiveness." Daniel stood there, breathing heavily, his fists still clenched at his sides. He had waited for this moment, this confession. And now that it had come, it didn't feel the way he thought it would. The satisfaction he had imagined wasn't there. All that was left was a hollow ache. "What do we do now?" Julia asked, her voice barely audible. Daniel stared at her, the woman he had once loved more than anything, and felt a deep, overwhelming sadness. He had no answer for her. He didn't know what came next. The next morning, Julia didn't go to work. She stayed in bed, wrapped in blankets, her eyes red from crying. Daniel stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching her silently. The house was eerily quiet, as if it too was mourning the loss of something that had once been alive. "We can't keep going like this," Daniel finally said. Julia looked up at him, her expression one of quiet despair. "I know. I need time to think," Daniel continued, his voice steady but emotionless. "I can't just move on from this. I don't know what's going to happen." Julia nodded, wiping her eyes. "I understand." Daniel turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the quiet, empty room. As he descended the stairs, he felt a deep sense of dread settle in his chest. Whatever came next, their marriage would never be the same. The house felt like a tomb. Every corner seemed to echo with the remnants of the life Daniel and Julia had shared. A life that now felt irreversibly shattered. The silence between them had become oppressive, a constant reminder of the truth that hung between them like a dense fog. Julia kept mostly to herself, staying in the bedroom or quietly shuffling around the house, avoiding Daniel's gaze. Daniel, for his part, had thrown himself into work. It was easier than sitting alone with his thoughts, easier than facing the reality of what had happened. He couldn't stand to be in the house with her, to be reminded every second of her betrayal. He found himself working late into the night, taking on extra projects just to avoid going home. But no matter how much he tried to immerse himself in his work, Julia was always there in the back of his mind. One evening, as Daniel sat in his office staring blankly at the documents on his computer screen, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was from their location-sharing app, a habit they'd developed years ago for convenience. His heart clenched as he saw where Julia was. Not at home, but in the same quiet neighborhood where Mark lived. The knot in his stomach tightened, a sickening mix of anger and sadness. He had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that after the confrontation things would change. That Julia would end it with Mark, that she would make an effort to repair the damage she had caused. But seeing her there, with him, only deepened the wound. Daniel clenched his fists, staring at the blinking dot on his screen. He could drive there. He could storm into Mark's house, demand answers, demand justice. But what would that accomplish? What was left to save? When Julia returned home that night, Daniel was waiting for her. He sat in the living room, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp. His heart was racing, his emotions raw and unfiltered. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Julia froze in the doorway, her face pale. She had been hoping to slip in unnoticed, to avoid another confrontation, but Daniel's presence in the living room meant that wasn't possible. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes dropping to the floor. I went for a walk," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. "A walk?" Daniel repeated, his tone laced with bitterness. "You were in Mark's neighborhood." Julia's eyes widened, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. "How did you—" "Does it matter?" Daniel cut her off, standing up from the couch. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he kept it controlled, kept it simmering just below the surface. "You said you were sorry. You said you didn't want to hurt me, but you're still seeing him. How can you stand there and tell me that?" Julia's voice cracked as she spoke, her face etched with guilt. "I'm trying, Daniel. I'm trying to figure this out, but I'm so lost. I don't know what to do." "Figure it out?" Daniel scoffed, his voice rising. "You made this mess, Julia. You decided to lie, to sneak around behind my back for 6 months. And now, instead of ending it, you're still with him. What are you trying to figure out?" Tears welled up in Julia's eyes as she took a step toward him. "I don't want to lose you," she said, her voice trembling. "But I can't just turn off my feelings for him. I'm so confused, Daniel. I don't know how to fix this." Daniel stared at her, his anger slowly giving way to something else. Something deeper, more painful. He had spent so much time feeling betrayed, feeling angry, that he hadn't allowed himself to fully process the sadness. The grief of losing the woman he thought he knew. The grief of realizing their marriage might already be too far gone. "You can't fix this, Julia," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Every time you say you're sorry, you go back to him. Every time you say you don't want to hurt me, you lie again." Julia's shoulders slumped, her body shaking with silent sobs. She didn't have the words to defend herself anymore. There was nothing she could say that would make this right. Nothing that could undo the damage she had caused. "I think you should go," Daniel said, his voice steady but cold. "You need to figure out what you want, but you can't do that here with me." Julia looked up at him, her eyes filled with panic. "Where am I supposed to go?" "I don't care," Daniel replied, the hardness in his tone surprising even himself. "Go stay with Mark if that's what you want. Just go." The words hung in the air, final and absolute. Julia's face crumpled, and without another word she turned and headed upstairs to pack a bag. The sound of her footsteps on the stairs was the only noise in the house, and it felt like a death knell to Daniel, a final, irreversible end to what they once had. By the time Julia came back downstairs, a small overnight bag slung over her shoulder, Daniel had retreated to the kitchen. He stood by the sink, staring out the window into the darkness beyond, his hands gripping the counter. "I don't know what's going to happen," Julia said softly, her voice raw with emotion. "I don't know if we can fix this, but I'm sorry, Daniel. I really am." Daniel didn't turn around. He couldn't. If he looked at her, he might break. He might let his anger crumble into something weaker, something he wasn't ready to face yet. "Just go," he said, his voice cold and distant. The door creaked open and then closed softly behind her. The house was still again, and Daniel stood there in the silence, his body rigid, his mind reeling. He had told her to leave, had pushed her away, but now that she was gone, all he felt was an empty, hollow ache. Was this really what he wanted? Was this really the end? The next few days passed in a blur. Daniel went to work, came home, and repeated the cycle, trying to numb himself to the reality of what had happened. He avoided looking at his phone, avoided thinking about where Julia was or what she was doing. But every time he walked through the door of their now empty home, the weight of her absence hit him like a punch to the gut. He had spent so much time planning his revenge, tracking her, reading her messages, waiting for the moment to confront her, that now, in the aftermath, he didn't know what to do with himself. The anger that had sustained him for weeks had given way to something far more difficult to process. Grief? Loss? One night, Daniel found himself sitting at the dining room table, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him, his phone resting in his hand. His fingers hovered over Julia's name and his contacts, debating whether to call her. He wanted to hear her voice, wanted to know what she was thinking, what she was feeling. But at the same time, he didn't want to give her the satisfaction. She had chosen Mark. She had lied to him, deceived him, and hurt him in ways he could barely comprehend. But despite everything, Daniel couldn't deny the truth. He still loved her. And that realization hurt more than anything else. Meanwhile, Julia sat alone in a small hotel room on the edge of town. She hadn't gone to Mark's, hadn't even told him where she was staying. She needed space. She needed time to think, to process the mess she had made of her life. She knew she had hurt Daniel, knew she had destroyed something precious. But now, sitting alone in this sterile, unfamiliar room, she was beginning to realize just how much she had lost. Mark had been a distraction, a temporary escape from the loneliness and dissatisfaction she had felt in her marriage. But now, as she sat in the cold, empty room, she realized that the excitement, the thrill she had felt with him was fleeting. What she had lost with Daniel was something real, something that had taken years to build. But could they ever go back? Could they ever repair the damage she had caused? Julia didn't know the answer, and that uncertainty filled her with a deep, gnawing fear. Days turned into weeks, and the hollow silence in the house became Daniel's new normal. He had hoped that, after telling Julia to leave, some sense of clarity would follow. Instead, he found himself more uncertain than ever, drowning in the void left by her absence. The anger that had fueled him for so long had dissipated, leaving behind only grief and a lingering question. Was this the end? He didn't know how to answer it. There were moments when he missed her so intensely that he could barely breathe, and others when the thought of forgiving her seemed impossible. His pride, his pain, the betrayal, it all felt like too much to overcome. But deep down, the part of him that still loved her hadn't disappeared. It haunted him. Daniel sat in his office one evening, staring out the window at the fading light. His phone buzzed on the desk and he picked it up, expecting a work email or a message from a colleague. But it wasn't. It was from Julia. Julia. Can we talk? I need to see you. His heart clenched at the sight of her name. He hadn't spoken to her since she'd left the house, hadn't reached out, hadn't answered her calls. But now, seeing her message, he felt a pull, an undeniable need to hear her voice, to face her again. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to shut her out forever. But the other part, the part that had been fighting to hold on to something real, couldn't resist. The next day, they met at a small cafe on the edge of town. It was the same place they used to go to when they first started dating, a quiet spot where they could talk for hours without interruption. But today, the air between them felt charged, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Julia arrived first, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. When Daniel walked in, their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He could see the exhaustion in her face, the guilt etched into every line. She looked smaller, more fragile than he remembered. "Hi," she said softly, her voice trembling. Daniel nodded, sitting down across from her. "Hi." For a moment, they just sat there in silence, the noise of the cafe a distant hum in the background. Finally, Julia broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness," she said, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. "I know I've hurt you in ways that I can't even begin to fix. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I've spent these past weeks thinking about everything I've done, and I can't stop feeling like I've destroyed the best thing I ever had." Daniel listened, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had heard her apologies before, but something about this moment felt different. There was no defensiveness in her voice, no attempt to justify or explain away her actions. She was just raw, exposed, vulnerable. "I know I made a mistake," Julia continued, her voice breaking. "I let myself get caught up in something that wasn't real, something that made me feel alive when I didn't feel it in our marriage anymore. But it wasn't worth it. Mark wasn't worth it. None of it was." Daniel stared at her, his emotions swirling. He had imagined this conversation so many times, her begging for his forgiveness, him feeling victorious, in control. But now, sitting here, all he felt was a deep, aching sadness. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said finally, his voice low and hoarse. "You broke my trust, Julia. You lied to me for months. I don't know how to move past that." "I understand," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't expect you to. I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. I needed you to know that I regret everything I did." The sincerity in her voice pierced through him, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. The anger he had clung to for so long had faded, replaced by the quiet realization that she was as broken as he was. She had made terrible choices, but she was also human, flawed, confused, and lost. "I don't know if we can fix this," Daniel said, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't know if we should." Julia nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I understand. I don't know if we can either, but I want to try. If there's even a chance, Daniel. If there's anything left, I want to try." The words hung in the air between them, filled with uncertainty, with the echoes of everything they had once shared. Daniel looked at her, remembering the woman he had fallen in love with, the life they had built together. It wasn't perfect. It never had been. But it had been real. And now, sitting across from her, he realized that letting go wasn't as simple as walking away. "I don't know what the future looks like," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know if we'll ever get back to where we were. But I do know that I can't make this decision right now." Julia nodded, wiping her tears. "I don't expect you to. I just needed to see you. I needed you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." They sat there in silence for a while longer, neither of them sure of what came next. The cafe around them buzzed with life, but for Daniel and Julia, time seemed to stand still, suspended in the fragile balance between forgiveness and moving on. That night, Daniel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Julia's words echoed in his mind, the sincerity of her apology, the depth of her regret. He had spent so long imagining a clear ending to their marriage. Either he would forgive her, or he would walk away for good. But now, as he lay there, he realized that life didn't work like that. There was no clean break, no perfect resolution. What did forgiveness even look like? Could he ever trust her again? Could he ever love her the same way? He didn't have the answers. But for the first time in weeks, the anger inside him had started to loosen its grip. In its place was something softer, something more complicated. He didn't know if they could fix their marriage. He didn't know if he even wanted to. But maybe, just maybe, they could start by facing the pain together. By talking. By being honest. The next morning, Daniel picked up his phone and sent Julia a message. "Daniel, let's talk." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't a promise of reconciliation, but it was a beginning. A small, tentative step towards something uncertain, but perhaps worth exploring. Whatever happened next, Daniel knew that they couldn't go back to what they were, but maybe they didn't have to. Maybe there was a way forward, even if it looked different than either of them had imagined.